Hey everyone, this is Megan with Nova Medical Centers. Thank you all so much for being here with us today. Several of you have been joining us for the opportunity to navigate through multiple challenging topics over these past few weeks. So we look forward to continue to provide these resources to you, and thanks again for joining us. Just a reminder, all of our Nova Medical Centers locations are 100% occupational, so our team members are doing their due diligence to make sure we're not allowing anyone in with sickness, doing proper screening for patients, so that way none of your employees or prospects or our team members are exposed to any sicknesses. I'd like to introduce Grady Phillips. He is the president of Corporate Medical Services. Many of you are familiar with him. He has been a tremendous resource for Nova and all of our clients. He's most of the time presenting at our Lunch and Learns, and recently with the current climate has been reaching many people through various webinars. So thanks again, Grady, for always being this constant. If you've never heard him speak, his goal is to make complicated subjects easy to understand at a conversational level, and look out for the occasional dad joke. But of course, every day brings new challenges, and we at Nova and CMS are doing our very best to keep everyone informed. So with further ado, Grady, take it away.
Thank you, Megan. I guess you have heard me speak before. All right, everybody. Look forward to speaking with you for the next hour or so. We'll try to get through this quickly. At any time, if you have any questions, we have people standing by at the Q&A desk, so they should be able to handle those. If there are any that seem pertinent at the time, we may jump in and I might get interrupted, which is terrific. Please feel free to ask us now or later. And as always, we will be happy to present the slide deck at the end of the presentation to anybody that asks, so don't feel that you have to take any notes. Hopefully you will take something out of it and just be present with us, and we'll get started. So our learning objectives for today. With regard to the CBD, first we'll go over history, chemistry, and biology, and then use. I tell people it's kind of like a really quick high school class with no quiz at the end. Of course, we're all homeschooling these days, so it's even more applicable than ever. But we'll dig into the production and then talk briefly about CBD and drug screens, which is what most people really want to know anyway. We're calling this the mashup webinar because we really don't know what these two things have in common, but they seem to go together. So moving on from there to sleep apnea, we'll discuss the problems, testing, the studies that are being done, and the DOT interactions there as well, with regards particularly to trucking. So if you don't know us that well, about half of our business revolves around trucking. Actually, I'll touch base on that in just a second. And in sleep apnea, the last thing we'll discuss, just a little brief covering on the COVID-19 with regard to sleep apnea. But first, a little bit about us. Our base work is as a medical review officer, where we review drug screens, protecting the privacy of donors and protecting the public safety. We're also a third-party administrator, where we facilitate occupational testing, not just in Chattanooga, but all over the country, and even in the U.S. territories. We also manage several different consortiums. Our consortium is called DotStop, primarily for small truck companies that need random testing support. We also operate a 24/7, 365 post-accident coordination service that all of our clients find helpful from time to time. It's something we hope you never have to have, but we are there when you need us. In light of this conversation, we do run a comprehensive sleep apnea program where we perform testing, therapy, and compliance monitoring for companies. Our chief MRO is Dr. Joseph Sintef, who is also the chief medical officer for the FMCSA in Washington, D.C. CMS has been in business since October 1st, 1995, so we are working on our 25th year in business, and in that time, we've reported nearly 3 million drug screens. And I'm your host for today. That's me. All right, jumping right in. CBD. Like I said, it's a high school class, so instead of a tale of two cities in English class, we'll talk off with a tale of two plants. You got marijuana and hemp. Are they two plants or are they just one, though? That's the twist. So marijuana and hemp are actually the same plant. They are cannabis. Cannabis, over the course of time, they have been cultivated for different reasons. These days, you cannot distinguish by the appearance. You just can't look at one versus the other. Like in the previous slide, it's pretty obvious. Hemp on the left, marijuana on the right. These days, though, it's they're genetically grown. You can't tell just by looking at them. And so we've moved on to a chemical definition where hemp is defined as anything with less than 0.3% THC. We'll talk more about that later. Where did they come from? Hemp, surprisingly, has been around for over 10,000 years. It's one of the world's oldest cultivated crops. They say that it's got 20,000 plus uses, paint, rope, paper, clothing, body, I don't know, use it for paint too, probably. But it's quicker probably to say what it can't be used for. It is truly a very, very versatile plant. Only recently have we been using it for CBD. Now, hemp was actually brought to the Americas by sailors. And the first fun fact of the day is that canvas sails, which is what all the old ships used, the root word of canvas is cannabis, because hemp sails were used, hemp ropes were used, all the rigging. It's told that over 60 tons of hemp were required to rig one of the ships. It was so popular back then that several towns were actually named after him. As a matter of fact, back to the Jamestown settlement, once Jamestown was settled, one of the very first things that Jamestown was required to do to start paying tribute back to Britain was to start growing hemp for these purposes. Hemp was also grown by George Washington, and in the early 1900s, it was even on the back of the $10 bill for a year or two. Now, you really know that you've made it when you're technically on the money. And so hemp was a very, very strong plant back about 100 years ago. Now, it started to wane around 1800 when cotton production was increased by something called the cotton gin. Now, the cotton gin made the production of cotton much faster, and so the labor-intensive hemp started to fall away. In addition, the medical use of hemp decreased in around the 1830s, 1850s, when something interesting was created, the hypodermic needle. Now, prior to that time, hemp was used for medicines and was used with tinctures and oils, which might remind you of today. And when the hypodermic needle but it was prescribed by doctors at that time. When the hypodermic needle was created, doctors were able to give a much more specific dose, and the drug of choice became morphine. At that time, they did not know that it was addictive. Hemp, on the other hand, didn't really affect everybody the same way. It was hard to tell exactly what a dose was, again, kind of like today. So the use of hemp decreased medically and also decreased from a structural as a rope or clothing or paper type process. Also in 1937, there was an interesting PR campaign in tax that really sounded the death knell for hemp. Now in the 1940s, when World War II came out, we quickly realized that our source of hemp, again still for these ships, was currently in Manila, and the Japanese had cut off our access to that. And so there was a propaganda video produced called Hemp for Victory. It's an amazing video, and hopefully we'll be able to show it in just a second if everything works well. So from 1942, soon as the war was over, we went away back into hemp. The tax was again levied, and all of the farmers that were trying to grow hemp at that time were basically, it was shut back down, is the easiest way to say it. So in the 1970s, the Controlled Substance Act totally put all marijuana products away so that we couldn't have them anymore. All marijuana, not just the THC, but also the hemp. And so it wasn't until the 2018 Farm Bill when President Trump legalized all hemp as an agricultural product. Now, what you do with the byproducts of that, how the CBD works, that's a discussion for a different webinar that we certainly can have as far as the legal use for it, but it was made available for an agricultural product 2 years ago. All right, we're going to try this. I've tried this before and failed, so we're going to hope this is an amazing movie from the 1940s that all farmers were required to watch, all kids in school had to watch it to try to do everything we could for our country. So here we go.
Hemp for mooring ships. Hemp for tow lines. Hemp for tackle and gear. Hemp for countless naval uses, both on ship and shore. Just as in the days when old Ironside sailed the seas victorious, with her hempen shrouds and hempen sails. Hemp for victory.
Wasn't that great? So that actually was a real propaganda video that we put out in the 1940s to try to encourage the growth of hemp, and then later threw it away. Okay, so taking a turn here, we're going to talk about the history of marijuana, which is different from hemp, not in the actual plant, the cannabis, but the way that it was cultivated to encourage the psychedelic properties of it. So as you can see, the history of marijuana, the earliest psychoactive that we found is around 3000 BC. It theoretically started in Asia, moved to the Middle East, then went on to India, went to Africa, and then slave traders brought it to the Americas. Slave traders used it to keep slaves docile, and that was what it was used for. So it made its way into the Americas where it was grown and basically stayed down in Central America until the 1900s. Now, in the 1900s, the Mexican Revolution, around 1910, the Mexican Revolution forced a mass exodus from Mexico, and we had a lot of Mexican people come up into the United States. Slave traders brought it to the Americas. 1900s, we had the Mexican Revolution, 1910, that brought recreational smoking up into the Americas. And at that time, it just started happening a little bit at a time, but we had this immigration. And around the same time, this is really interesting, and some people call this a conspiracy theory, but there's a lot of evidence. The 1930s, around 1933, Prohibition ended. We had this guy named Henry Anslinger, who was the first commissioner of the Bureau of Narcotics, who had spent his time fighting not fighting prohibition, but enforcing prohibition. When it ended, there were a lot of federal agents that needed something else to go after. At the same time, you had this guy named William Randolph Hearst, the newspaper magnate. He basically ran the media at the time. Mr. Hearst also had tremendous resources in the forest department to make the paper that he needed for his supplies. It just makes sense to diversify that way. Well, remember in the 1900s, after the cotton gin was passed, the same thing happened with hemp. There was a decoordinating machine. So in the 1917 or so, the hemp was considered to be, quote, poised by a comeback. It was called a billion-dollar industry. And Mr. Hearst very possibly was concerned that his supply of paper would be threatened by hemp to be able to do that. So with all of those things together, there was something that was put out called Reefer Madness. Huge PR campaign, huge for the time. You can read the information, but we've all heard of Reefer Madness. The idea is that it's a super dangerous drug that people smoke at one time and are drug crazed, and it really pushed the boundaries of realism, obviously, with regard to marijuana. Now, at that time, this is also interesting. We'd always called it hemp or cannabis up to that time. Mr. Hearst coined the term marijuana at that time. It was done in order to accentuate the Mexicanness of the plant. Racism was strongly encouraged. You can see that at that time, not only Spanish, Mexican, but even African American were all demonized for being addicted to this marijuana. And so that really started the downward trend of marijuana. Now, I mentioned in the hemp that in 1937, there was something passed called the Marijuana Tax Act. You can see the spelling. That is still the way on federal documents that marijuana is spelled, by the way. But marijuana was taxed almost out of existence. The people that were the most upset about this were, in fact, the doctors that, except for around the hypodermic needles that we talked about, were not happy because they could no longer prescribe the marijuana tinctures that they had done up to that point to help people. So about 30 years go by, and then, with all the Vietnam stuff going on, we then passed the Controlled Substances Act, which totally removed any cannabis from our country, right? Well, no. We've all found out that the best way to create a demand for something is to tell people that they cannot have something. I don't know, toilet paper. But you can see up until for the next 40 years or so, it was a constant fight. And only now with recent state legalizations are things changing in the other direction. All right, so there's the history of marijuana and hemp. We take a step back. We're going to get out of history class. We're going to jump into biology just for a minute. It's always interesting to know what's in a name. What does it matter? Well, marijuana and hemp are both cannabis, as we've said. In the 1750s, there was a guy named Carl Linnaeus. He's the guy that named everything. And you've heard of binomial nomenclature like Homo sapiens. He named this cannabis sativa. Sativa means things that are cultivated. So the guy that created the whole system, one of the things he named was cannabis. I just think that's interesting. So that was the original species name. Now, a while later, about 30 years later, there was a French naturalist named Jean-Baptiste Allemant that found indica, which I think it was in India that he actually created or found that, but I can't remember for sure. And all the way in 1924, there was a Russian scientist that discovered ruderalis. Now, there's a lot of dispute as to whether or not these are actually different species, In fact is, marijuana is subject to artificial selection and dispersion across the planet. There are so many varieties that it's almost impossible to tell if those plants ever actually existed. But there's a common phrase, and this is just the nomenclature, that sativa plants give you an energy or a mind high, whereas indica plants give you a mellow or a body high. And you can remember this because indica is indicouch. All right, but the truth of it is that due to that hybridization, there are no pure samples left. There is absolutely no scientific way to pull one of these plants from another, and these phrases are totally subjective. Quite literally, somebody smokes whatever it is and say, I think that's got a lot of sativa in it or indica. That's the science that we're left with in these situations. All right, we're out of biology class. That was a quick one. Let's jump into chemistry. This is where we want to spend a little bit more time to understand this. So we're talking about cannabinoids. CBD is cannabidiol. It's one of over 113 cannabinoids that are found in cannabis. Of those, there are 16 main classes. So marijuana and hemp are both cannabinoids. Marijuana and hemp both possess cannabinoids. And these are the 16 main classes. Again, don't worry, no quiz, but we'll give you the notes if you want to keep up with these later. The first one that was discovered was in 1899, cannabinol. Now, at that time, they thought cannabinol was the psychoactive drug, but it's not. It's actually a sedative. And it wasn't until 1963 they found the next cannabinoid, which is CBD, our little buddy that we're talking about today. 1 year later, they found THC, and then we had the 60s, and everybody fell in love with THC. And, you know, that's, again, another topic for a different day. But let's zoom in just a little bit on THC and CBD. Now, like we said, they're both found in every cannabis plant. The total for cannabinoids is around 20 to 30%. Now, the other 70 to 80% is the stuff that makes it a plant, the fibers, the proteins, the plant-like materials. So the cannabinoids are really a rider onto the plant itself. So in marijuana, you'll have between 5 to 30% THC, and in hemp, less than 0.3% by definition. Remember, we talked about earlier, that's what hemp legally is 0.3%. On the flip side, you will have various CBD in marijuana. They correspond. So the more THC you have, the less CBD in every single plant. In hemp, you can have up to about 20% CBD. And that's where these plants have been cultivated to expand the CBD in them and therefore minimize the THC. So that's how it works. Jumping in just to CBD. So CBD is cannabidiol. Some people call it, I can't even say it the other way around. I try to say it like cannabis, cannabidiol. It is non-psychoactive. That doesn't mean that it doesn't have an impact on your body, but it doesn't have a psychoactive impact on your brain. Now, as we said, it naturally balances with THC. It can be sold as oil, tinctures, edibles, and, you know, literally you can sprinkle it on your Cheerios. It is sold as everything, as everybody knows. Now, varying concentrations, we'll talk more about that in a minute as far as how strong CBD is actually sold. The scientific method of action is not technically known, but that's not surprising. A lot of things we deal with do not have a known method of action. We do know that there's an endocannabinoid system that exists in all mammals, all animals. I think it's everything except for insects. And for context, we discovered this endocannabinoid system in 1990. We found the opioid receptors, which is a similar part of our body, in 1973. So we've known about the opioid receptors longer than the cannabinoid ones. Okay, so CBD, what's it good for? Absolutely nothing. No, people claim it's good for pain, anxiety. So these are the things that we believe it may be good for: pain, anxiety, PTSD, insomnia, seizures, high blood pressure, acne, and more. You know, some people rub it on their joints and swear by it. Some people take a few drops. Some people take a lot of drops. Truth is, we're surrounded by anecdotal but not scientific information. And all that we have are stories, kind of fireside chats, if you will, of what worked for whom. The truth, the science, what is it good for? There actually is an FDA-approved prescription, Epidiolex. Epidiolex was approved by the FDA in June 25th of 2018 for very specific and rare forms of epilepsy: Lennox-Gastaut syndrome and Dravet syndrome. Only for those two. Now, going back to what we said about the anecdotal evidence, all you have to do is spend 5 minutes on Facebook and you'll find people saying, don't worry about epilepsy, just take CBD. Absolutely not true. Disinformation, bad information. Epidiolex, specifically CBD, has found to be useful specifically just for 2 severe forms. And it only costs $32,500 a year. Now, I love doing this at, like Megan mentioned, at Lunch and Learn, where I'm seeing people's faces when you see that. That's a pretty good sticker shock. But if you think about it for just a minute, the dosage that they recommend for these seizures is between 200 and, say, 1,800 milligrams per day. Well, a bottle of CBD that you can buy at any health store, pharmacy, or whatever, typically the most concentrated one you'll find is 1,000 milligrams for the entire bottle. So if you do the math, at about $80 per bottle retail, you're spending somewhere in the neighborhood of $50,000 at that high end of the dose if you buy it off the shelf. So, there's a lot of talk about how the FDA stuff is going to be more expensive, but if you compare it to what you can actually get in the store to have a manufactured, guaranteed product with this, there's actually a lot of strength to that. And it's strawberry flavored. So, that makes all the difference. There are a lot of scientific studies underway, with the recent change. I mean, this has only been legal for a couple of years. And so getting the federal funding set up to do true scientific studies, it shows a lot of promise for analgesic, anti-inflammatory, antioxidant use. But the only way to really test this are with double-blind studies where you have volunteers that are willing to take it, and you have medical personnel who are willing to give it, and neither one of them knows whether what they're taking is truly CBD or a placebo. And only when you compare that to nothing, the goal is always to beat the placebo, because it's amazing how many people on a placebo feel so much better. And that, placebo is a sugar pill. And so if you can beat the placebo, you've really done something. So we'll wait and see what actual scientific uses there are for this medicine. What side effects are there, though? Fatigue, diarrhea, changes in appetite. It is, by all accounts, non-toxic. Now, the World Health Organization has said that pure CBD is not toxic. So that's what makes it such a great thing to sell basically any store, is that CBD is not particularly dangerous. Now, you do have to talk to your doctor. There's a lot of drug interactions that people don't realize, such as antibiotics, NSAIDs like Advil or Aleve. There is a interaction there where it can reduce the impact of standard painkiller drugs, as well as antibiotics. Allergy, antihistamines, if you're on beta blockers or on antidepressants or antiepileptics, all of those can be affected by CBD. So you got to talk to your doctor. This is not just something that you drink and it makes you feel better. It's not a Red Bull. All right, so moving into the production of this. So now that we understand a lot of the history, the biology of it, let's get into demystifying this magical substance, all right? So first thing we're going to do is talk about a couple of industry terms. One is, if you go to CBD store, pretty much the first question they ask you is, do you want full spectrum or isolate? The full spectrum is what they call the full profile, or has the entourage effect. And truthfully, it has an unknown concentration. Now, the full spectrum is basically all the plant goodness, and we will get into how you get into all the plant goodness, and they just concentrate it down into an oil. The isolate is typically only CBD. A true isolate will have no THC in it whatsoever, has a very defined concentration. You know what you're getting, and that's the difference between the two. So the full spectrum is basically the entire plant, where the isolate is not. So how's it made? Now, remember, we're in Tennessee, and I'd like to tell people my brother-in-law actually has a hemp farm. So grows it, gets it extracted, and I've spent some time out there. This is not something that we are against as an MRO. It's something we want to learn more about. It has real potential. So, this stuff is made. It's a farm product, either marijuana or hemp, whichever way you're growing however much THC is in it to begin with. You cut it down, you grind it up, and then you run it through an extraction machine. Now, typical extraction, you'll either use CO2, ethanol, and you can even use olive oil to extract that stuff. Once it is extracted, you get something called crude. Now, crude can either be just diluted with other oils, typically MCT or hemp seed oil, or maybe MCT is like a coconut oil, and they sell it, or it can be winterized and distilled to form the isolate that we talked about. So on your left, you can see pure CBD really resembles flour. Not a whole lot different. It's a white powder when it's purified. That's CBD. Okay, our job is always to demystify this, as Megan said. So let's find some common grounds, because that extraction, although I'm trying to explain how that works, it seems complicated. So the ethanol extraction, if you've ever had vanilla extract, you know what ethanol extraction is. Basically, you have the compound, which in this case is a vanilla bean. You soak it in some type of ethanol, typically, bourbon or maybe vodka, and it extracts the vanilla flavorings out of it. That's what a vanilla extract is. CO2 extraction. You ever had decaffeinated coffee? Same process. You run CO2 at extremely high pressures. It becomes CO2 turns into a I can't remember what it's called, but it's both a solid and a liquid at the same time. And it absorbs the caffeine in the case of coffee, or the CBD and the parts of the plant, the cannabinoids, in the case of hemp or marijuana. So decaffeinated coffee. And again, we're in Tennessee. So if we're talking about distillation, we're going to look at a still. Same basic process, just, highly scientifically done when you're talking about CBD. You do short path distillation. You heat the product up to a certain degree, which evaporates out the liquor or the CBD or whatever you're looking for. And that's how you extract a very distinct process. So those are the common ways that we do basically the same thing that you've seen it for a long time. All right, so there's the production. Let's get to the question everybody's here for. Will CBD show up in drug screens? Nope. CBD is not a drug of abuse. It's not tested for in drug screens. We don't look for it at all. Now, for clarification, I'm only talking about lab tests. Instant tests, they're not any good anyway. They can give you about a good guess, 70% if you're lucky. So I'm only talking about lab certified, where you go through a confirmation test to verify that this is true. But in no shape, form, or fashion will CBD show up in a lab test. All right, so then what's the big deal, right? Here's the big deal. CBD products are not regulated by the FDA. There's a little bit of regulation if a producer claims that it's a food additive. The CBD will sometimes come after them, but very minimal oversight. You'll see this label on a lot of these, that these statements have not been evaluated, or something along those lines. But the truth of it is, CBD oil can contain anything. You see those QR codes on the label. I can make one of those that tells you that I am from Italy or wherever. But you can say anything in these QR codes. You can say anything on the label. It's not regulated. You don't trust it, and that's the problem. Now, growers are not really worried as much about THC. They're worried about heavy metals. So if you're a grower in here, Tennessee or Colorado, wherever, you get this stuff tested, not too much for the THC version, but to make sure you're not going to kill anybody with your product, because you don't know what's leaching out of that soil. Again, the World Health Organization has said pure CBD is safe without abuse potential, but products are not subject to the regulatory standards and it leads to a huge inconsistency in manufacturing products and practices and the quality of the products. They say not only have the molecular concentrations been identified as inaccurate, but these are concerns for contaminants like the heavy metals I'm talking about, the microbes, the mycotoxins, as well as THC. So from a drug test perspective, we're thinking about THC, but you got to keep in mind there's a lot more to that. There's actually a case that has been reported in some magazines lately where a gentleman tested positive for THC. He blamed the bottle of CBD that he had, and it says on the article that this guy bought CBD that was, quote, grown in a secret foreign location. I mean, come on, guys, you got to be smarter than that. You can't trust the label, but even if the label tells you that we're not going to tell you where it's coming from, you really got to look at that stuff. Pesticides are another thing to keep in mind. Remember that full spectrum, that full profile? If your plants have been covered in pesticides and they take that biomass and just extract it and you get the full biomass, guess what you're putting into your body? So these are the concerns. Now, there are lots and lots and lots of good growers out there. There are lots and lots of bad growers out there. And that's the problem that we're seeing is, not that anybody wants more government oversight, but that's what you're going to run into is less with these situations.
Hey, Grady, we have a question.
Yes, ma'am.
So does that mean there's the bottles that do say that they contain THC, those won't show up in a drug test?
Oh, Megan, I'm about 2 slides behind you on that one. That's a terrific question. We'll get there in just a second. Okay, so keep in mind, if THC shows up in your system, it is not due to CBD. CBD is not a reason. And this, on the left, this image straight out of the MRO regulations for DOT. You must not accept an assertion or an assertion of consumption or other use of a hemp or other non-prescription marijuana-related product to verify a marijuana test as negative. It's not allowable. If somebody has put something in their body, we as an MRO can't verify that. We can't see if it's true or not. And so therefore, we must not accept that somebody tells us, oh, I'm just on CBD. Specifically left out. All right, Megan, I'm going to answer your question now. So there's a lot of that. Actually, my notes say that a lot of you are probably wondering about the full spectrum oil that has the 0.3% THC. Okay, first of all, we are not giving medical advice. I'm not telling you whether or not to go out and buy this stuff, but I will show you some government studies that we found. Here's one. This one's from 2001, which was really before CBD was in the picture. At that time, hemp seeds were popular, and there was a concern about how much THC would be in or on the hemp seeds. So what did they do? They did a study, double-blind study. They had volunteers to take specific amounts of THC in graduated doses over 40 days. So every single day for the first 10 days, they took a minimal dose of THC. They actually started with 0.09. And I find this number very interesting, just kind of glory by accident, because if you take a bottle of 0.3% THC, CBD oil, and you do the math, what that means is if you drank that whole bottle at once, you would be ingesting 0.09 milligrams of THC, not CBD. We're changing gears, talking about THC. So you would actually be consuming 0.09 milligrams of THC. If you do that, there's the positive line. That's where those guys tested after 10 days of taking the same material. Now they graduated all the way up, and you can see on this chart, all the way up to 0.45 milligrams per day of actual THC. Now, for some context, one joint has 16 to 30 milligrams of THC, but even at the equivalent of 5 bottles of a 0.3% THC per day, they did not show positive. No positive test. Second study basically upheld the first one. They found that at about 0.54 milligrams of total THC per day, that they did start finding some positives. So about 0.5, so roughly, 6 or 7 bottles of CBD per day is when you would see a positive. And I'm hitting the disclaimer button here. This is if what's on the label is actually what's going into your body, and it's just way too often it's not. We heard another large MRO give a talk on this a year ago, and he used a comment that I like. He said that the industry is polluted with THC. And so you may very well think it's 0.3 THC in your bottle. You might even think it's 0 on your bottle and be unfortunately very wrong. So here's the summary on CBD. Do not authorize CBD use for your employees. If it's DOT drivers, whatever, don't go there, because as soon as you authorize it, they're going to hold you to that. We do have evidence that some DOT, particularly trucking companies, have terminated drivers just for listing CBD in their physical, and they've been upheld because marijuana derivatives are still a Schedule I drug. Also, keep in mind, we do expect FDA approval to come sometime in the next few years, widespread, probably just for the isolate. The full spectrum will probably maintain an herbal for a long time in the future. All right, so I think we're actually doing pretty good on time. I think I've got a few more slides here. I might have to speed up a little bit at the end, but let's jump into sleep apnea.
Hey, Grady, quick question.
Yes, ma'am.
So do you mind to go back one slide?
Not at all.
So do not authorize CBD use for employees. And that's for both DOT and non-DOT, correct?
Yeah, that's a recommendation. I mean, if somebody is using it, that's one thing. If they disclose it, how you handle it's another question. But I certainly would not say, sure, it's fine to use it, and then they fail a drug test, because guess who they're going to come blame for that situation? And you don't, it's same as the MRO, you don't know if they drank a bottle of CBD or if they've been smoking joints every other night.
There's no way to differentiate in the test.
No, there's not. This is a good question. There is a way to differentiate between, there's one FDA approved prescription for marijuana-like product. It's called Marinol. This is outside the course of this webinar, but if you ever go into a surgery setting, you might very well be given Marinol. That is an FDA-approved prescription that contains THC. Now, you can't drive, can't use any operation, you can't do anything when you're actually taking it. As an MRO, we can do a test that differentiates between Marinol and herbal usage, but I mean, CBD is herbal usage. So the same as smoking a joint is the same as using CBD. So there's no way to differentiate between those two.
Okay.
Good question, though. Okay, sleep apnea.
Quick, one more.
Yeah,
quick.
please. I'll go back a slide.
What are the rules in California, whether they have a prescription or not, on marijuana or hemp? So I guess that would for any of the recreational or medicinal states.
No doctor is allowed to actually give a prescription. They can write different states call it different things. They can write a recommendation. They can write a suggestion for whatever. For marijuana, recreational states, you can just get it different. Every state is different. And we actually, in disclosure, we have a full length CBD talk that kind of gets into that a lot more. But federally, marijuana and all cannabis-based medicines, drugs, whatever, are still a Schedule I. So there is no prescription except for that Marinol available. So as an MRO, what most large MROs do, if somebody claims to have a medical prescription, if it's a federal test, we say, too bad, that doesn't count, as you saw in the medical handbook. If it's a non-federal test, we still turn it as, we do not overturn it as positive, but typically we'll make a note that says person has claimed to have a medical marijuana card and let the HR people differentiate that way. And here's why. A lot of companies may have federal contracts. You might be testing in a certain state, the company domiciled in a certain state, but the employee might be working in a different state that has different rules. So the rules are just everywhere. So we as an MRO don't have that information. And so we have to only overturn it if it's an FDA approved prescription. That's kind of a quick answer. Whoever asked that, if you want to know more, definitely reach out to us later on. We'll get into that. All right. You sure, Megan? Any more questions?
We'll
We'll see. Sleep
we'll see.
apnea.
Yeah.
Sleep apnea. We need to get moving on this anyway. Sleep apnea has a handful of problems. The marketing problem. Sleep apnea is marketing for people that snore. If you start looking up, this is what you're going to see. I particularly like those two slides in the middle where they clearly had the same photo shoot. They said, hey, swap places to take the pictures to show this stuff. You know, the lady on the bottom is just totally put out with the whole thing. But sleep apnea is not a silly problem that's about snoring. The real problem is the social stigma. People may think they have sleep apnea. People may know they have sleep apnea, but people don't want to be identified with sleep apnea. They're concerned about what it might mean for their health insurance, what it might mean for their job, what others may say. You know, it's still embarrassing. And truthfully, until sleep apnea therapy is no more concerning than somebody wearing glasses or contact lenses, we still have work to be done. But the actual problem, you know, what is sleep apnea? You've probably seen stuff like this before. Sleep apnea is very simple. Sleep apnea is the relaxation of throat muscles due to things like aging, smoking, being overweight, some ethnicity, and some people are just born this way. We're not talking about central apnea. So this is obstructive sleep apnea. There's also something called central apnea. That's not really part of the discussion. That's a much minor type of sleep apnea that's out there. Most tests don't look for it, but they look for the presence. If you have central apnea, you need to go to a sleep doctor and really get it worked out because you have some serious problems. Now, I'm showing you an example of what a sleep test would look like. As you can tell, there's a lot of information on there. A lot of people may have seen this. This is actually a result from the ResMed products that we use with a home sleep test. And it gives a lot of information that we're not going to go into here. Most people try to boil it down to this scale. What's my number? It's unfortunate that we've come to that because it is a science. It is reviewed by a sleep, a test done properly is reviewed by a sleep specialist that can authorize any type of treatment. Just to be on the scale doesn't give you everything that you need. But as you can see, this particular test had an AHI of 17.1. Now, let me tell you just a little bit about what these numbers mean. So AHI is an apnea and hypopnea index. And apnea is designated as a cessation of airflow for at least 10 seconds, although it may be longer, 30 seconds or more, without you breathing at all. That's considered an apnea. The AHI is apnea and hypopnea index. A hypopnea is designated as a greater than 3% oxygen desaturation and also a greater than 30% drop in nasal pressure. So the difference is an apnea is when you totally stop breathing. A hypopnea is when you breathe so shallowly that you're not really getting any oxygen in and out of your lungs. You're just able to barely get any air back and forth. And it's a real struggle. So the AHI is the overall index. So it's apnea hypopnea index per hour. So in other words, this person had some issue breathing about 17.1 times during that hour. As you can tell, that's a problem. So there are lots of different types of tests that do this. And the one we just showed you mentioned the ResMed home test. This is essentially what it looks like. You wear a belt. It measures the pulse, measures the oxygen level at your fingertip, and then you wear a cannula on your nose to do the testing. There's other ones. The other type that we are fond of is called the watch pat. Totally different methodology. And it uses something called peripheral arterial tone to measure it instead of the actual nasal work. They're both good. They're both misleading though, because the one on the left is the worst night of sleep that you'll ever have. Clearly that's inaccurate. Taking these tests they're just uncomfortable as they can be. The watch pad is not nearly as bad unless you wake up in the middle of the night and decide to pick your nose. But these are the two different tests. Now there's also lab-based testing. Home testing does a really good job of establishing obstructive sleep apnea. Sleep labs do a much more thorough job. Sleep is a very complicated thing, and why people can't sleep can be so many different things. But if you just want to do the home test that tells if you have obstructive, these are good reasons. All right, so let's talk just a little bit about, the slide shows side effects from sleep apnea, but it's also symptoms. And that's what people don't necessarily understand correctly is if you're seeing these problems, a lot of times the problems may cause sleep apnea and sleep apnea may worsen the problem. So you can see sleep apnea affects so many things. It's not just about being sleepy in the day. It's not about keeping your partner awake with your snoring. There are dedicated links with sleep apnea to brain fog, obviously, anxiety and depression, heart arrhythmias, high blood pressure, diabetes, impotence, obesity, and stroke are all clearly defined. Matter of fact, there's some studies that say that a person with untreated sleep apnea has 3 times the risk of dying due to any cause when compared to somebody who has either treated or doesn't suffer from sleep apnea. And that was an 18-year study over 1,500 patients. One thing is that, like I said, sleep apnea can actually cause things like obesity. Now, obesity is a risk factor. We'll look at that in a second. But if you don't get a good night's sleep, you don't feel like exercising in the morning. If you chronically never get a good night's sleep, your exercise and sleep conundrum it's a downward cycle where you get less sleep, so you exercise less, so you get less sleep, so you exercise less. So, a lot of these things are working together. Now, we want to show a little bit of science on this. And like I said, we deal a lot with the DOT, with sleep apnea with regard to truck drivers. And so this is the article that I'll pick. There are thousands of good articles out there, but this one was a defined study with regard to truck drivers. What they found is that sleep apnea, OSA is obstructive sleep apnea, is associated with an increase in all-cause mortality. Like we said earlier, just having it you have a much higher likelihood to die and a lower life expectation if it's not treated. Specifically, heart attack, stroke, high blood pressure, like erectile dysfunction, depression, diabetes, just like the previous slide showed. They showed that truck drivers have a sleep apnea estimated at 28 to 78%, which is more than 5 times the general population. So they're thinking the general population has 3 to 7%, but you look at these numbers and what they really know is, kind of like the COVID testing, we don't test that many people that don't show symptoms, so it could be much higher. With regard to a truck driver, the chances that a truck driver with untreated sleep apnea will have a crash is 243% times higher than driver without it. Huge. And that, so like we said, if you're not in the DOT or truck driving industry, it's the same principle if you're driving a car. You have a significantly higher chance of having a car wreck. Well, nobody's ever going to link that to sleep apnea. Typically, a heart arrhythmia might kill you in your sleep. They don't link that to sleep apnea. So there's a lot of things that you don't necessarily realize between the two. To sum it up, they found that CPAP intervention in 348 of these drivers resulted in, it's huge, nearly a 50% reduction in per member per month healthcare spending. This is the big deal about sleep apnea. It is that it affects so many things. Getting a good night's sleep is so important. And with things like the increased obesity for Americans, we are seeing more and more people that have that. All right, sleep apnea, can it kill you? Here's Princess Leia. It was the official cause of death for Carrie Fisher. Now, she had other complicating factors, but this was the official cause of death that they linked for her and other people along with you. Anytime that you have a problem breathing, if you have another problem, if you have a heart issue, if you're having, in her case, a chemical issue, or, diabetes, something else, it's sometimes all that you need to make your health that much worse. Okay, so why should you test your employees? This is an example that we show people. So again, this is more along the lines of DOT, but there was an example with Greyhound Bus. There was a driver who took his DOT physical test, and I know Nova provides DOT physicals to a lot of you guys out there. And the sleep test doctor said, you know what, you've got some of these symptoms. I think you should be tested for sleep apnea. Gave the guy, I think it was a 3-month certification. The guy goes out, starts driving, essentially falls asleep and has a rollover and kills a bunch of people. It's a terrible incident. So the plaintiff attorney said, well, I think it was sleep apnea that caused it. Greyhound denied that. Greyhound said, I think that he was drinking some coffee and passed out or something. And the plaintiffs forced the court to have this driver take a sleep apnea test. Turned out he did have severe sleep apnea. Greyhound settled a week or two before the court date for $6 million. This is a situation where the driver the Greyhound was not aware that he did have sleep apnea. They only knew that a doctor said, you really need to be tested by this. And they were found to be significantly liable in that situation. There you go. So that's a reason to take this very seriously from not only a health standpoint, not only an insurance cost standpoint, but also a liability standpoint. All right. So who needs to be tested then? All right. With DOT, they leave everybody to the best practice of the medical examiner. Now, in our full term webinar on this, we talk about the DOT timeline. We talk about how it came about, why there's no specific regulation that medical examiners have to follow to that. But the general consensus is a risk factor, somebody with more than 39 BMI, or somewhere in the neighborhood of a 33 with other risk factors such as age, smoking, small airway opening, which is the Mallampati score. And I know half of you out there saying, I know what that is, but for those who don't, this is your Mallampati score. A class 3 or 4 Mallampati score means that you have a reduced or smaller airway. These people are at higher risk for sleep apnea. So it's just another risk factor that you're looking for. Another one would be blood pressure, diabetes. This is a flow chart that we like from DOT, and this looks complicated, but it's really not. Basically, it follows the same principle. If you've got a 40 or more BMI, then they recommend that you get a 3-month medical physical and you can notice all of the risk factors there in the middle. Pretty much the same things that we looked at, but this is what we'd like to distribute to medical examiners that ask of how can I have, a lot of medical examiners with the older tests, there are different tests called the the Epworth scale and the stop bang test, which basically you look at the person and say, are you sleepy? And anybody that's not an idiot says, no, I'm not sleepy. And then you don't test them. This gives you an objective test. If this person has a BMI, if they have a history, if they have comorbidities, then this is a good objective goal. Okay, so we wanted to touch base on COVID-19 with regard to sleep apnea because there's been a lot of news lately about that. And we'll start off by hitting the disclaimer button this time. We are not giving medical advice. Do not take any of this as though you need to or don't need to take any action with regarding to COVID-19. A lot of what we're about to say is just public information that's been put out by doctors, by news, by other things. But technically, sleep apnea devices are ventilators. CPAP, APAPs, BiPAPs, and VPAPs. So do a little minor history class here. CPAPs were the earliest. CPAP stands for continuous positive airway pressure. I tell people it's like standing in a strong wind. You put one of those things on and it blows your eyes out. This is the old school. Now, the old school is you had to get them titrated to where you got a specific pressure that you had to live with. Technology improved. Now we have APAPs, and that's typically what we sell to our people that need therapy. APAP is automatic positive airway pressure. It adjusts and automatically titrates that pressure. So when you first put it on, it has a minor pressure. Whatever you need to sleep during the night, it adjusts up and down every 5 breaths or so. The next one is called a BiPAP. BiPAP is a bi-level positive airway pressure. So when you breathe in, it has a higher pressure, and then it relaxes and lets you breathe back out against it. And then you have VPAP, which is variable positive airway pressure. People don't use that too much, but it's somewhere between a CPAP and an APAP. Oh, went the wrong way, sorry. Still not giving medical advice. Okay, so there's news that some CPAP machines or PAP machines are being used for COVID. Only BiPAP machines may support some COVID-19 cases. Now, BiPAPs are not typically sold as standard. They're a little bit more specialized to most people. They do require not just a home sleep test, but a full lab test to get there. So if you are a person that needs sleep apnea, if you think you need sleep apnea, now is a really good time to figure out if you do need it or not, because if you have a respiratory distress symptom, like we talked about earlier, like all these other comorbidities, if you already need the help and then you have a virus, which is a severe respiratory virus, it might make survival a lot more difficult for you. So it's time to make sure that you have all the respiratory support that you need. Talk to your doctor, talk to a sleep specialist. You need to get this taken care of. Now, there's been a lot of concern about what they call aerosol droplets if somebody is using a CPAP machine in a hospital. If you've not heard this, don't worry about it too much, but it's just to give you this information. So the studies are showing that there is some possibility of what they call large water droplets. If the ventilators that people are talking about in hospital, they have you intubated. Typically, they have you put to sleep. They have a tube down your throat. You don't want to be awake for that. And it stays in your throat. Every breath that you take is run in and out of a filter. So the chances of you exposing the virus that happens as you shed or as you breathe is almost zero. Well, if you put a mask on somebody's face and they breathe, there's a possibility that they'll blow some air out the side or not a good fit or something. So you could theoretically still have virus. The studies are saying, yeah, but not any worse than if somebody sneezed or somebody coughed. So it's not really, at this point, doesn't look to be a terrible concern. The idea of using you still want the personal protection, but the idea of using these PAP machines for the minor COVID cases is showing a lot of potential here. So we, are excited for that. It's not something that we particularly help with, but the availability of thousands, if not millions, of devices that can be used to help the less severe cases is really huge. All right, so that's that talk. What are your solutions? What are your ideas with sleep apnea? Like we talked about, going back to that Greyhound thing, going back, get a company policy. It's not a bad idea, especially if you have DOT, especially if you have safety sensitive positions that are subject to a medical examination. If there is any desire for a sleep apnea test, have a company policy, have a program that you can use to get these people tested. You don't want to expose yourself by just throwing it out and saying, well, you worry about that. It's a good idea to have a referral program with a deadline. And that way, if your process is, look, when somebody's identified, they have X number of days or X number of weeks to get that done, have that policy, stay with that policy. And that's what's important. And that is the end of the presentation. Megan, do we have any questions or anything at this point?
We sure do. We've got a few here.
Okay.
All right. Lauren asks, so sleep apnea can be flagged as a possibility that the employee needs to take a sleep test in the DOT test?
Yes, it is very common for, when you do a DOT physical, the maximum you can give somebody is 2 years. If the DOT examiner believes that you should receive a sleep test, they typically reduce that certification. And typically what we see is 3 months. Now, again, there's no hard regulations. All DOT examiners are not required to follow any specific guidelines. They call it best practices. So a DOT examiner can reduce that certificate and say, I think you need to be tested for sleep apnea. We see that all the time.
Okay, great. And then Miss Angie. Hey, Angie. Once the CPAP is prescribed, how can the employer tell if the machine is being used? Do you know if Tennessee DOT monitors truckers' usage of the CPAP machine?
Great. No DOT authorities monitor it. Some companies monitor it. So the ones that we sell, the ResMed, the current kind of high-end machines, all have a built-in cell phone modem. Now you're going to make me geek out because this is the coolest thing. We can actually monitor, not exactly real time, but basically within 12 to 24 hours, somebody's usage. Even if they drop it off a cliff, throw it in the water, whatever, there's no card required to read it. So we can provide that and do provide that for several DOT carriers that show, who is actually using those machines. So it's A, to make sure that they are safe on the road, and B, to make sure that a lot of times the company's investing in these machines, they want to make sure that they're not just being in the backseat of a vehicle, they're actually being used. And so the machines themselves can be monitored, but again, no regulations, no requirement. Typically, the only hard line that we see is when a person goes back for a DOT physical, if they are honest, and I wish everybody, but if they were honest, they acknowledge that they have sleep apnea, and typically the medical examiner wants to see a 1 month history, sometimes a 3 month history to show that they're using it before they'll issue them a new card.
Okay, great.
Hope that wasn't too complicated.
And Angie says, good. Angie, that's good. Glad to know. Glad you're feeling better. And then Kristen asks, I was told by a potential driver that he was required to get a sleep apnea test because his neck size met a criteria per DOT, making it a requirement to get his physical. What is the rule by FMCSA? He is new to CMB, and this was his first physical.
Okay. Like I said, full length when we go through this, I don't have the slide prepared with me, so this is kind of from memory, but there is at least a 10-year history of trying to get regulations on this. Our history with sleep apnea was about 15, maybe 13 years ago. We were driving to Florida on a family trip late at night. 2 tractor trailers flew past us. Tremendously bad wreck. We were stopped on the side of the road for hours and hours and found out that one of the drivers had fallen asleep and he and his co-driver were asleep. The other vehicle was trying to catch them and trying to wake them up, screaming, honking the horn, CB. They all wrecked. Only one survivor told the story. That encouraged us to really get serious about this. There were no regulations at that time. You'll all remember when Tracy Morgan in New York had a serious accident where I think people actually did lose their lives, and they found out that sleep apnea was an underlying cause of that accident. There was also a train accident in Hoboken, New Jersey that killed a bunch of people. So for a while, FRA, the Railroad Administration, and the trucking were trying to get regulations passed, and we were at the brink of that. And it just so happened that the election, we changed our president, and the current administration is very against regulations. We're in a deregulate. So they said, we're not passing any new regulations. We're not making any new rules. And so it put it back to best practices. Okay, so I know this is a long way around your question, Kristen, but there are no actual DOT regulations that say what is defined to who has sleep apnea or what a medical examiner has to do with it. It is left to their best practices. Now, if a medical examiner says this is a DOT rule, if they say that to a person to basically enforce it, then that's not something that I can understand how they might do that, but it's not actually true. It is common that a neck size is used as a risk indicator for sleep apnea.
Very good. Great. That looks like all the questions that we have for today. Anyone else have anything? Send it in the box.
It's not common that I'm 5 minutes early on these things. I usually run a little bit over, so that's terrific. I'm glad. I hope everybody got something out of it. I hope everybody is enjoying. If you're at home with the kids or the pets, we've all been there. Appreciate everybody getting through this time together, and we're looking forward to all going out and having picnics this fall.
Yeah. Hey, so real quick, remind them. So you've got a few webinars that are already available, like on demand. Are they on the website?
Yeah, they're on our corporatemedicalservices.com website. We've got a lot of resources for the FMCSA clearinghouse. We've got some resources for for the COVID-19, especially with regard to the latest FMCSA things. We've got some webinars out for the Clearinghouse. We've got some that we've done actually for Nova and others with regard to COVID-19 and FMCSA changes as well.
Yeah, that was a really good one.
Thanks. Yeah, that was we had to put that together in a hurry with all the changes that happened so recently. So hopefully everybody's is kind of understanding where we are in this new normal. But we got a lot more to come in the future. So we look forward to working with Nova, working with others to go from.
Yeah, and if you guys want a copy of the slide deck, Grady's information is right there. You can also reach out to your industrial director at Nova, and we will be more than happy to help get you the resources. Nothing else. You guys have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you again for joining us, and have a great week.